Hope and grace. Two things from God that I think can truly carry us through anything. So I offer you this episode today that I know is going to bring you hope in times of despair. The wisdom of my wonderful guest who has such a pure heart is something that can be a welcome distraction on this election Tuesday, but it is something that can carry you through the hard times. It is a reminder that it is okay to grieve things that are lost. It is okay to feel the heaviness of things as they come. But it is also important to move forward and to unite your wounds with Christ's wounds and to experience the joy that comes from redemptive suffering. Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome to the Persistence in Prayer podcast hosted by Catholic mindset coach, wife, mother, educator, and speaker, Kylie Hine. Kylie is passionate about helping you deepen your relationship with God through the power of prayer. This podcast is a space for high achievers who want to do it all, but also want to prioritize their spiritual life and grow in faith. Join us as we explore the beauty of persistence in prayer and the transformative impact it can have on our lives. Get ready to discover practical tips, insights, and inspiration to help you develop a daily prayer practice and cultivate a deeper sense of trust in God's plan for your life. Let's journey together towards a more fulfilled and faithful life as we invite the Holy Spirit in. Let's begin. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, I am joined by Megan Hjelmstad. Megan is a wife, enthusiastic hockey mom, and Army veteran living in Denver, Colorado. In her spare time, she serves as a Catholic writer, speaker, and women's mentor, helping women to embrace their God-given dignity and deepen their prayer relationship with the Lord. Megan is the author of an upcoming book on redemptive suffering, a writer for spiritualdirection.com, which is one of my favorite resources, by the way, and a founding team member of Blessed is She, a global Catholic women's ministry. Megan adores books, sleep, sunshine, and Colorado's great outdoors almost as much as she adores Jesus in the Eucharist. Megan, I'm so thrilled to have you here today.
It is such a gift to be here. Thank you, Kylie.
If you were closer, you are definitely my kind of people. Books, sleep, and sunshine. Those are an essential three for me.
Absolutely. Yeah, I had a little bit of a hard time waking up this morning with the sunshine going away. So we're working on that piece. But praise God for this gift of time together and to get to know each other better and to, just glorify the Lord through all that he has to share with us.
Yeah, and you're actually my second West Point grad that I've had on here. So that's exciting too.
Yes, I believe it or not, Jessica and I are actually friends and classmates.
Really? Hey,
Yes.
you knew exactly who I was talking about. So anyone listening, if you remember Jessica Castillo,
Yes, absolutely. We had some good times together.
she's amazing. Well, I just want to jump right in. I like to just get to the heart of the matter. And I know we have limited time. As we mentioned to one another before we started this episode, it's just God's divine intervention. I think that we are recording this on the feast day of St. Pope John Paul II. And we're going to be talking about redemptive suffering, which I think is so beautiful and so needed. Can you
Absolutely.
tell us what is redemptive suffering?
So redemptive suffering in its most basic form is a prayer of intercession. And intercessory prayer, we might really kind of come to know intercessory prayer as just being able to pray for others for their good. And so what I have learned over many, many years of difficult suffering is that suffering itself, united to Christ, can actually be a form of good for our own souls and other souls when we allow Jesus into it to redeem it. So it's taking something that the enemy has intended for our evil and our destruction and our separation from God, and actually letting Jesus be victorious in it and giving us hope and giving us the victory over the enemy. And in the process, drawing us so much closer to the heart of Jesus and his desire for our souls and his desire for other souls. So even though suffering itself is a great evil, the gift of redemptive suffering is an absolute hidden gem in the spiritual life and one that has been such a gift in my own life.
What is your journey with suffering? Do you mind sharing?
Not at all. So you mentioned that I went to West Point. So I got to know Jessica Castillo there. I went to West Point because I lived there as a young girl. My dad was in the military. So I grew up in a military family. We lived there when I was age 4 to 7. And I fell in love with this college campus that is unlike any other college campus you can imagine. I wanted to be a cadet when I grew up, and that dream never went away, even after we moved away. So I ended up coming back as a cadet myself for college. And in the process of becoming a cadet and meeting all of these wonderful other high achieving men and women, I met my now husband. We couldn't stand each other at first, but the Lord took care of that over time. And as I was going through West Point and even in the process of applying when I was in high school, I had been dealing with some really severe abdominal pain, which I later learned was endometriosis and adenomyosis. And so I had learned both in I'm a cradle Catholic, and so kind of in the Catholic world and in the military world, um, that pain is just kind of something to be endured and ignored if possible. Pain and redemptive suffering wasn't actually a very popular topic of conversation in the Catholic circles I grew up in, and really isn't a fun thing to talk about for anyone. So as soon as I got to West Point, especially, it was just this kind of mentality of suck it up and drive on. And so even though I had lots of great things going for me, I met my husband, we graduated, we got married. I also had this underlying disease that was progressing and getting worse and worse. And endometriosis can affect fertility in some really significant ways as well. So the Lord blessed us right away, praise God, with two beautiful children. But then I really started to deal with a lot more pain. And by this point, my husband and we had been in the Army for a few years. We were serving on active duty. I was working full time. I had a 14-month-old and a probably 3-month-old. And the pain came back in force. And so I went to several specialists, and they all told me that this is, even though it hadn't been surgically diagnosed yet, that this is what is probably going on, and you probably won't be able to have any more children. And so at that point, it was very disheartening. And shortly after that, I suffered a miscarriage, followed by a really traumatic ectopic pregnancy for which I had to have emergency surgery. And that surgery revealed that I was absolutely covered with endometriosis. And so I really started to have to grapple with suffering as a reality in my life, affecting my family, and also grapple with how does this actually tie into my faith and what I profess to believe and how I pray. And in the process, so our family patron is St. Jude. I kind of sent up this half-hearted prayer for St. Jude to just pray that maybe we could raise one more baby. And I found out shortly after that I was pregnant, and our beautiful miracle son was then born on St. Jude's feast day 9 months later. And so he's about to turn 13, but that was really kind of this foray into understanding that God wasn't just expecting me to try and power through suffering or ignore it, but that he was actually present in my suffering, and that he cared, and that he grieved with me. And so from there, because of all of the difficulties with endometriosis, I ended up having 4 surgeries total. The 4 surgery finally really treated everything that needed to be treated, including most of the pain, but it left me unable to have more children after that. And then because of all of that pain over the years and trying to manage it with a lot of different over the counter medications, I developed severe digestive issues. So I got to the point where I was only able to eat about 10 foods total. And I'm still in that place. And that was extremely isolating not only physically trying to interact with friends, family, so much community. It's centered around food and eating, but it was really difficult to deal with physically and mentally and emotionally and spiritually. From there, I ended up developing some strange pain in my hands and feet, which later some spine issues surfaced. And so, about 3 years ago now, I was diagnosed with a degenerative spine disease. And I also had a very likely from my airborne training in the Army, a surgery that I had to have on my neck because of this condition called Eagle syndrome that could cause a stroke risk. And so it was kind of this domino effect. It started with the endometriosis and the adenomyosis, but then really progressed into affecting my daily life, my mobility, and this degenerative disease I have has the potential to land people in wheelchairs eventually. And so it kind of became my whole life. So after about 15 years, first on active duty for 5 years, and then in the Army Reserve, reaching the rank of lieutenant colonel, I had to step back from my Army career. I had to really adjust things and prioritize, my health as well as my family with the limited energy that I had. And through all of this, I discovered that when praying for healing and praying for physical healing over and over and over again for so many different conditions, for so many different hopes and dreams that I ended up having to let go of, that God was still providing healing in really deep spiritual ways, even if it didn't always manifest in the physical healing that I wanted and desired at the time. So that has really been my journey and my discovery of the Lord's presence and his hope that is available in suffering. And it has gotten to the point where even with far more suffering than I ever would have imagined in my young life 20 years ago, I would not trade a single ounce of it for the grace or the spiritual gifts that I've received and for the privilege of getting to offer it for other souls every single day, day in and day out.
What a beautiful story. So hard, I'm sure, to live through. As some of the things that you've mentioned, I have lived through myself. And I apologize for me getting emotional over here. You talked about your miscarriage and your baby. And when I had a miscarriage, we call that baby Jude. So when I was praying this morning, Jude kept coming to my mind and my heart. And so when you just talked about that, it was just such a God moment for me. So thank you for sharing. And I think most of the women here can relate to being a high achiever, which you yourself obviously were as someone who went to West Point. And then you go through this shift in your life where sometimes if we don't slow down on our own, the Lord says, guess what? I'm going to allow something to happen that's going to force you to slow down a bit. And you have been living that repeatedly. What
Yeah.
has helped you, if you think back to the beginning, when the endometriosis first started to happen, finding out that you weren't going to be able to have more children, what was it that helped you to keep going, that helped you to cling to hope in the midst of that?
Yeah. You know, that's a really hard, not only question, but reality for, I'm sure, so many listeners because it involves grief. And a lot of times I think we want to skip over the grief to get to the lesson and to get to the hope instead of having to wade through the grief. And I think it surprised me a few years back that so our parish held a beautiful mass for pregnancy and infant loss. And my husband said, "Hey, I think we should just go to this, just to support it because it's such a beautiful offering." And I said, "Yeah, I absolutely agree." And so we went to this beautiful mass, and it had been 10 years since my miscarriages, and I didn't expect to be that deeply affected, but it's surprising sometimes to find that there's always another layer of grief. And there is another layer of grief because there's always a deeper level of healing that the Lord wants to bring to us. And so I think it's really important to not skip over that grief. And that Mass was a beautiful healing experience for both of us in a way that we hadn't anticipated, even 10 years later. And so I think that remembering that our journeys aren't just a linear, neat line, but that it's really a circular journey and that we're going to end up facing a lot of these things again. Um, but with more history with the Lord, with more of his grace, more of his support, more relationship that he has already brought us through healing in other ways and is bringing us to a deeper layer of healing. And I remember someone actually saying that's about St. John Paul II that he kind of even wrote in this way where it seems circular in a lot of his encyclicals, but it seems like we're going back to this point that actually each time we're taking it a little deeper. And so, um, I really have witnessed that looking back in my own life that it's been a journey of going deeper in a lot of areas where it seems like I've already been there and I should have quote unquote learned the lesson, but the Lord is bringing me to deeper healing. And so, yeah, just as an encouragement to anyone else who feels like they might be in that bit of a roller coaster or yo-yo in terms of getting to hope. Um, it's okay for it to take time and it's okay for it to kind of seem like it's going back and forth. One of the things that I think was a true gift over the years of healing was really understanding that in that death, whether it was the miscarriage or having to let go of my dreams or my career, in that death was a seed of new life and new purpose and new mission that he wanted to bring out of it in a fuller way. And so even when we had to die to the dream of having a big family, I remember when my husband and I were engaged and we were sitting in army training, I passed him a note of a little sketch of like 4 or 5 years from now, or maybe it was 10 years from now, it probably would make more sense. But I had drawn the two of us and a score of kids, like
Mm.
a baby all the way up to. And so just dreaming of the big Catholic family. And so when that dream died and we have three beautiful children here on earth, it really invited me into, first and foremost, exploring the truth of my identity with the Lord. And what is my identity if I can't do this thing that I anticipated doing, or if I can't be this type of person that I thought I would be. And it allowed him to really strip away those constraints of who I thought I should be and how I thought I should do things to become who he created me to be. And so, specifically in that death of a big family and being a mother to many, many, the Lord showed me that he was inviting me into the gift of spiritual motherhood. And so I began to feel a call to pray for priests in particular. And then I found out about an apostolate called the Seven Sisters Apostolate or Ministry, which some of your listeners might know that the beautiful ministry that kind of adopts one specific priest and has 7 women band together to offer a holy hour for him every single day. And so I was able to start that at our parish for both our pastor and our parochial vicar. And then I was also invited into beginning some women's ministry, and not only women's ministry rather, but women's mentorship through Blessed Is She. So walking individually and in groups with women and just really allowing the Lord to help me exercise the gifts of spiritual motherhood that he had given me for the sake of his beloved daughters. And so even though I was raising 3 beautiful children and being able to really practice the gifts of physical motherhood in that way, the Lord really expanded this place of spiritual motherhood with other souls that he had just in his generosity entrusted me. And so that was a real lesson of just because I have a desire and I think it's going to play out this specific way doesn't mean that God won't fulfill that desire and fulfill it in a much more beautiful and deeper way. Um, so yeah, that was in relation to really physical motherhood. And then in relation to career and having to shift and let go there, which is, ooh, after 15 years in the Army, that was deep seated in my identity. When I started discerning for health reasons that I needed to step away. And at that point, I was having to travel at least every other month, if not every month across the country for military duty. When I started discerning letting go of that, I just realized how much of my identity I had allowed to be wrapped up in this this image of being not only a woman in the Army, but a high ranking officer in the Army, and allowing myself to, whenever I was there for duty each month that I would fly out, to kind of get caught up in the more superficial goals and 5-year plans that all of the individuals in my unit were talking about. And so it was a gift from the Lord to be invited to pray a 54-day rosary novena, just to discern, do I really need to be here at this point? And there's a lot of things coming up. And for many years, the Lord had kind of kept his hand on me whenever I wanted to lean out of the Army, kind of pushing me back in and saying, no, I still want you here. But at this point, I felt that maybe there really was some detachment coming. And so through just being in the gift of our mother's arms and that rosary day after day, I started to discover these deeper roots of identity and understand that the Lord was not inviting me to remain and to try and prove myself through my physical capabilities and through this arbitrary patch on my shoulder or my chest, this patch of rank that somehow would distinguish me, but that he was inviting me into a more hidden mission in which he wanted me to be in his quote unquote army and not just helping prepare souls for a physical battlefield as the army does, but to help souls in the spiritual battlefields and offer my suffering for them in the spiritual battlefield. So just like with our family, it, I was able to kind of understand that in this desire that the Lord had initially given me was a much deeper fulfillment that he intended for me and a much deeper way of living it out than I could have even imagined.
Do you mind me asking, what was your prayer life like during that time, especially as you were discovering that so much of your identity was wrapped up in the military and in this doing? And I'm guessing, was your husband still in the military at that time?
Yes. And he is, at this point, he's still in the reserves. So the reserves, just to give people an idea, the Army Reserve in the roles that we were participating in is 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year. Of course, we were still doing emails every day and having to work from home in between those 1 weekend a month of duty requirements. But on active duty, it was much more difficult. By the time I got off of active duty, I had 3 kids, 4 and under. And so I would say at that point, as a very young professional, my prayer life was very sporadic. And it was, even though I had a deep, deep faith and I had been a cradle Catholic and I loved going to adoration, especially as a young mom, it was kind of um, just praying when I felt the the prompting and the desire and had the energy to. And so it was really just kind of when it worked out once in a blue moon, especially going to the church. When my son was in preschool and after I got off of active duty and I had started to be a stay-at-home mom for the first time between my reserve duty weekend, I remember taking my older two to elementary school. My youngest was in preschool. And I had this moment in the car when I was listening to Catholic radio, and a wonderful priest was talking about the importance of praying a holy hour every day. And I just thought that's ridiculous. And so as soon as he said that, he said, and if you can't pray a holy hour, pray a half an hour. And I thought as I was listening to him, well, our church doesn't even have a perpetual adoration chapel. We only have adoration at specific times. And he said, and if you can't go to an adoration chapel, sit in front of the tabernacle in the church. And if you don't have half an hour, take 10 minutes, 5, and so on. And if the church is locked, sit in the parking lot. And so by the end of this whole series of excuses that I was going through in my head after this priest had refuted every single one of them, I was coming up to the turn to our parish on the way home from school that I would pass every single day. And instead of just driving past it and making the sign of the cross as I normally would, I made a turn and went in with my son, who was in preschool at the time. And we sat there for 5 minutes, and there was so much peace. And that happened to be at the start of Lent. And so I was able to, from there, really begin to understand the value of a daily discipline of prayer. And I think the gift of a daily discipline was also in learning that the word discipline, the root of the word discipline is discere, which means to learn. And it's the same as the root word for disciple. And so it's really, prayer is just really sitting at the feet of the Master, of the Lord, and learning and letting him teach us. It's being in relationship, as the Catechism tells us. It's not performing like we often try to make it out to be. It's not any of these metrics that we try to meet in our lives of performance and all of the disordered expectations that are swirling around us and in our world. But it is a real retreat into relationship with the Lord, who strengthens us for what he is calling us to do. And so it really started then that I was able to begin practicing a daily discipline of prayer. And by the time I got to the point where I was having to travel across several states for reserve duty, I had enough of a prayer routine at home or at the chapel every day, whether it was usually just reading the daily readings and meditating in silence for several minutes afterwards, maybe 15 minutes to a half an hour at that point. I had enough of a daily discipline that when my days were much more full and structured with an army schedule, waking up early, going to physical training at 6 a.m. and having to work all day, that I was still able to find those pockets of white space that the Lord highlighted, whether it was sitting in my office at breakfast and doing the daily readings, and then taking some time at lunch to reflect on what I had read and what had stood out, or occasionally even going over to the chapel on base, which was not too far away, and just spending a little time in the chapel on my lunch break. And then being able to, even while traveling, pray my rosary on the plane. So I think it's hard for us when we're so overwhelmed with so much busyness and so many expectations to come to prayer. There's always resistance from the enemy, of course, but I think it's especially hard for us as women because we feel so often like it's another measure of pass or fail, of performance, of our worth, instead of an invitation into God's divine strength. And so that's what I really found to be of so much value when I was in the midst of working and in the midst of my most busy days, that those little pockets of time in prayer were what really grounded me and helped me to maintain my perspective, even when the world was trying so hard to distract me and pull me back into disordered thinking.
So beautiful. And I think it's just a testament that we just have to start. We just have to begin, even if it's 5 minutes with your kid pulling into the church parking lot or wherever it is. And like you said, developing that self-discipline so that when you are traveling or when it's a weekend or when it's vacation, the excuses don't overtake your commitment to spending time with the Lord. And we can be intentional about recognizing, just like you said, those white pockets. Or you talked about praying your rosary on the plane. I would have never in my life considered doing that until I had a structured prayer routine. And then it was like I found myself desiring to pray my rosary when I was on the plane. But never would I have even considered that until I had a very structured prayer time and routine. And I was speaking to some women this past weekend. I had a speaking event, and afterwards we were talking, and many of them are retired now. And so they said, I just really didn't have that until the kids were gone and I retired and I wasn't working. And I just want to remind anyone that work's a full-time job. You don't have to wait. The best thing I ever did for myself and for my family was I started getting up at 4:15 in the morning, which sounds absolutely ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous, but for me, I knew I needed the structure. I had to do it every single day, even if it meant I did it on the weekend and then I went back to bed until the kids woke up. Because if I didn't, the excuses just overran everything like they had for, the other 30 some years of my life. I just had to start. And the peace that you said you felt, I know I felt that. It's like God gives us that extra spiritual candy at the beginning because he knows that we need it,
Yes, for sure.
and he
Yeah.
shows up.
Yeah. And I love what you said about starting simple. And that's something that I often tell women too is you're not going to be offering a holy hour a day right off the bat. And in fact, if you think you should, if you think that's the measure of quote unquote good prayer for you when you're just starting out, then that's a temptation from the enemy to draw you into failure and despair and get you to quit. And so one of the best things that you can do is to start simple so that whatever prayer you commit to, and in that simplicity, to not take in too much content too. We are so easily tempted to content consumption over contemplation, and to be able to just commit to one thing, whether it's the daily readings and 5 minutes of silence after the fact, something that you can do on your hardest or most busiest or fullest day, or even a sick day while lying in bed, is one of the most wonderful ways to get started so that you can maintain that commitment and it can absolutely grow from there. And the Lord will really kind of, if you're being faithful to that commitment, he will show you when and how you can begin to expand that. But it's really easy to compare and despair our prayer life and to say, well, she's doing this, I should be doing this too. And someone else's prayer life is a poor excuse for your relationship with the Lord.
Yes. And I'm so glad that you brought up silence because I think this is so important and so overlooked. Like we are all called to contemplation. We don't have to be in a monastery. We can find the quiet time. Like we need it. And there are so many beautiful apps out there now with meditations and things like that. But we still need the quiet reflection and not a thinking exercise, but just being with the Lord and letting him do the work, not us.
Yes. I had a really powerful moment one day praying the Angelus, which we have a reminder that goes off in our house at noon, which really helps. Reminders are fantastic. I'm a big fan. So I was praying the Angelus one day, and just in the space of praying it, I realized I was rushing the word. And so I slowed down just a little bit and I allowed myself to just remember that I was in the presence of the Lord and the presence of our Blessed Mother. And clearly, God gave me the grace to do that. And thankfully, I responded. But it really brought me to this understanding of, even if, like that wonderful priest said on Catholic radio, even if we don't have an hour, a half an hour, even 15 minutes, we always have a minute. We can always make a holy minute. And how much can the Lord of eternity do with a minute? He can do everything. in that space. So,
Yes. And I think that's such a simple prayer too. I think I started this particular opening to my prayer reading St. Francis de Sales, but he talks about placing yourself in the presence of God. And so sometimes I'll just start my prayer with loving and gracious God, I place myself in your presence and ask the light of the Holy Spirit to shine on me, in me, and through me. And if you can just say something as simple as that and then just sit for the rest, the other 55 seconds.
yeah, yeah. The power of the present moment and being aware of God's presence is, yeah, nothing matches that. And so many saints have talked about that. St. Francis de Sales, St. Ignatius of Loyola, he says to always start prayer with a reminder of presence of God, becoming aware of the Lord's presence. And I think for our humanity, that is a huge benefit because we can so easily be distracted by the temporal world that's all around us. That's what seems like reality to us. But the truest and the most eternal reality is God. He's the only thing that will never pass away and who will never leave or change. Everything else around us is changing and it will eventually pass away. But the Lord and his presence is the only thing that we can truly rely on. So, yeah, allowing ourselves to come into his presence and to be aware of that is such a gift of not only awareness, but that peace and that help and that strength, that eternity infused into our ticking clock of every day.
Yes. Amen. Peace. If you feel like your life is crazy and you're stressed out because you're worried about all the things, I know when I start to feel myself like I feel the anxiety building up, it's usually because I'm thinking about all the things that I'm supposed to get done today. And the Lord's always like, no, 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 like I'm right here, just right here. And when I can just rest and say, okay, I'm in the present, I'm with the Lord, everything's fine. There is so much peace. And he provides a way to get the other things done or they don't need done. I think it's as simple as that. And we just overcomplicate it.
Nothing truer. Yeah. I love this truth that so many times we take up extraneous crosses that we don't need to take up. And the Lord commands us to take up our cross and follow him. But if we're too busy taking up all of these other things that he hasn't called us to, then we won't have the strength to take up the one cross that he has called us to, which he always gives us the grace to bear and the fruit that will come out of that. And so I just love what you said about not doing all of these other things, but yeah, even being able to ask the Lord, what is the next thing? What's the next thing that you want me to do instead of what is the next thing on my to-do list from all of these other people who have peppered me with all of these demands and expectations. But what do you want, Lord? What do you need from me? And that can really free us from so much, so much that we don't need to do and give us really that rightly ordered mindset of checking in with what are God's priorities for me? Because those are the priorities that will truly get me and my loved ones to heaven. Those are the priorities that will allow me to be truly happy and fulfilled and at peace. Not all of this other stuff that is oftentimes just a distraction.
Yes. And I want to do a whole episode on this at some point, but I think something that helped me so much was recognizing that sloth is not only laziness. Like every virtue is in the middle, if you think of a pendulum swinging. And sloth can also be when we are over busy, even if we're doing good things. Like they might be all for the church, but it's that, what's that saying? If the devil can't get you to sin, he'll get you to be busy. Right. And so it's just like taking on all of the things. And I talked to several women in a spiritual formation group I'm in recently, and all of us had just had this conversation with our spiritual directors where we were asked to do something by a priest or for a really great cause. And our spiritual director was like, maybe not.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I would say that one of my biggest turning points and when I was stepping away from the army was what I call my year of stripping away after I had a very similar conversation with my spiritual director a few years back. And she just said, "You sound really stressed." And I was like, "Oh no, these are all good things." And praise God for her patience. But it really got to the point where I heard that and I had to start asking the Lord, what are your priorities for me? And how have I mismanaged or disordered these things in my life? And it, it's so true that our yes is sacred. And so the enemy will try to do everything he can to get in the way of that and to have us give all of these extra yeses that will spread us too thin. And so I I firmly believe in the power of a holy no. And as women, this is the hardest part, I think, not apologizing for that no. To be able to say, I'm not able to do that right now, or I am not being called to do that right now, but I will pray for the person who is being called. But it is a hard place to get to and such a freeing place to be, I think, when we can finally begin to practice those sacred yeses and those holy no's.
Yes. I just think of the mindset that you spoke of earlier, the suck it up and drive on, that is so ingrained in so many of us. I still struggle with the good and holy no because I'm like, then I feel guilty. The people pleaser in me is like, I just want to say yes to you and help you out because I don't want to see you struggling to find someone else. And that's hard, but
Yeah.
it is holy to say no sometimes at the right times.
Are you struggling to find the self-discipline for committed prayer? Struggling to put first things first with all the noise and busyness around you? In my one-on-one coaching sessions, we start by creating a plan of life, a way for you to show up and truly commit every single day. It's more than just writing it down. It's about discovering what's really holding you back in your prayer, in your relationships, and in all the things that God is calling you to do. And no, it's not that you don't have enough time. So we're going to dig deeper together, and you'll uncover the root cause and start showing up for prayer with ease. If you're ready for that change, click the link in the show notes for a free confidence and clarity call with me, Kylie.
I just want to circle back around to redemptive suffering for a minute because I know that a very transformative writing that helped me through a lot of my suffering. And I know it has also been very powerful for you from St. Pope John Paul II. Do you want to talk about? I'm guessing that we're talking about the same one. Salvifici Dolores. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes. So I had the privilege and the honor when I was 4 years old and my dad was stationed in Italy of meeting Pope St. John Paul II. And I have a very vivid memory of this. We were in an audience in the large, I'm forgetting the actual name of it right now, but the large building. So it wasn't an outdoor audience. And I remember him walking toward me and he saw me and he said in Italian, "Ah, che bella bambina, dai un baci." What a beautiful child. Give me a kiss. And he kissed me on the forehead and then moved on down the line. And I also remember at that time, my mom had kind of propped me on the edge of the partition that was lining the center aisle. And so that was my earliest cognizant memory of physical pain was that partition digging into my little 4-year-old chubby legs and kind of swinging my high topped sneakers and trying to get comfortable. And also at the same time meeting John Paul II. And it's really beautiful to look back and understand that that moment, my earliest memory of pain, it was at the very same time infused with the grace of meeting and connecting with a saint, was exactly what this encyclical that he had written 4 years earlier was about. And that encyclical is about the gift of grace and hope that is hidden within every single form of suffering that we experience. And that every form of suffering, again, evil as it may be in its origin, is a powerful, powerful conduit of the Lord's redemption for our soul and for other souls. So we can simply say when we're feeling pain, and this is not just physical pain, by the way. We suffer in so many ways. We suffer physically, but also emotionally, mentally, spiritually. So any suffering, any pain, any grief that we're experiencing, we can simply say to the Lord in our head, in our heart, out loud, Lord, I give this to you. And then we can entrust it to Him for Him to bring good out of it. And a lot of times we won't be able to see that good in our lifetimes. And that's the hard part. We're impatient creatures and we love our instant gratification and we're used to it. We're used to, 2-day or overnight now packages from Amazon, right? And so it's really hard for us to wrap our heads around the fact that God will absolutely bring a far more victorious and glorious victory from any suffering we offer Him, but in the time span of eternity. So we won't always see it right now. We will often have to wait in order to see what that glorious, victorious victory over our suffering is. And that maybe it won't be visible until the next life. But the truth is that God is truth Himself. He is hope. He is redemption. And anything and everything we offer Him, any suffering that we have, He will absolutely 1000% redeem for a greater good. And the more we are able to do that, whether it's through a morning offering, whether it's just thinking in this moment of intense pain, Lord, I lift this to you, I give this to you, use it for good. Any time we do that, we are inviting intimacy with the Lord on the cross. And there is no greater love than Christ's love from the cross. That is the epitome of love itself. And so as we allow Christ into our suffering, we allow the purest and most powerful form of His love into our lives more and more and more. And that love just transforms us. And it brings us to a place of intimacy and union with Him that we would not be able to experience any other way.
Yes. If you have not read this encyclical, I think I'm going to link it in the show notes for anyone who hasn't read it because it's so good. And there are different parts of it that I remember standing out to me. One was there's a whole section on suffering is not necessarily a punishment. So like suffering has a meaning as punishment when it's connected with a fault, but it's not true that all suffering is a consequence of punishment because sometimes it's like, oh, well, this is happening to me because I made this choice or I didn't do this. But Pope John Paul II really talks about how suffering is an invitation to God's mercy. And just like you said, the answer to that question of why is there suffering in the world, as you read this, is truly revealed as love. It is the meaning of suffering as the Lord invites us into it. And Pope St. John Paul II also says suffering, it's a call and it's a vocation in and of itself. And I think that is so truly beautiful. As you share your story, which I can't imagine what it is like to walk in your shoes and everything that you've been through. And so many people I know who have struggled with so many things. And it could be so easy to fall into despair, that sin against hope over and over and over again. And I'm sure you've had your moments where it's like, Lord, I can't take anymore. I've had enough. And then He comes in and He gives you that little break. At least that's what happens in my life. He's like, okay, breathe. And then here we go again. But it's like He strengthens you in those consolations so that when that next wave comes, that next thing, that next disease, that next whatever it is that's going to keep you from doing or bring you the grief because your dream of what you thought you were created for is no longer the thing that God is revealing to you as He brings you, I think you said earlier, new life, new purpose, new mission, which is so beautiful. And
Yes.
right there.
Yes. Yeah. I love what you said about it not being this one for one punishment and highlighting that truth. Because even though we understand that there are consequences for sin in the world, a lot of times it's that the temptation is to look at ourselves and say, well, this is all my fault. Or on the other end of the spectrum, you mentioned that mean between two extremes before, that mean of virtue between the two extremes. The other extreme is I I shouldn't be going through any of this. And so to understand, St. Ignatius talks about in his ninth rule of discernment, the three reasons for desolation. And we can very easily substitute the word suffering for desolation, because desolation itself is a suffering, it's a spiritual suffering. But he says that the first reason is a consequence for us not maintaining our commitment. So when we're not communing with the Lord, when we're not, for example, eating a healthy, well-balanced diet, if we're eating junk food every single day, there are just going to be natural consequences to that. We're not going to feel great. We're not going to have a lot of energy. And the same thing happens in our spiritual lives, right? If we're not setting aside that time for communing with God in relationship every single day, and we're not receiving his grace and his strength, then we're going to be weak. But that's only the first reason. So even though there are natural consequences, it's not like a one for one. It's not, I did this, I told a lie and I got cancer as a result. That's not how any of it works. The other reasons for desolation, the other reasons that we might experience suffering, are the fact that God might allow it as a child that makes us stronger. So if we think about a toddler learning to walk and the parent moving further and further away from the child so that the child's legs can become strong and the child can actually learn to walk instead of just be picked up and carried around everywhere. And eventually, after learning to walk, learning to run, this suffering or this desolation may be something that God allows. He doesn't ever will it directly, but it may be something that he allows because it can be for our greater good and maturing and strengthening spiritually and being able to do more and more that he has created us to do. And the last reason that God might allow desolation or suffering is to remind us that it's not our own power that we do anything. And I think this is, again, so important for us to remember as women, that a lot of times we think, well, I did X, Y, and Z in prayer and I got consolation. And therefore, I did a good job and I found the magic key or the magic hack and I did this. Or, I went through these steps and I felt better. And therefore, this is the key and this is the answer, as opposed to all consolation and all reprieve from suffering is a gift from the Lord. And it's not by our own strength or power that we do anything good. And so it helps us to realize God's sovereignty and his power and our weakness, not so that, we feel kind of brought down a notch, but rather so that we can actually begin to live out of that authentic identity as God's daughter and look to him as father and put all of our problems and our needs on him instead of on ourselves. And that really destructive temptation to self-reliance that we face so often.
That was such a beautiful explanation of Rule 9. I absolutely love it. I hadn't heard the description of the toddler walking away. I think that's such a great way to explain it, of strengthening our legs. And the humility one, where the Lord's teaching us. I think it was St. Ignatius himself who was like, God gave him his mission and he knew what it was. And so he just went out after it and left God behind. Lord's like, no. You can't do this by yourself. So if you are not familiar with the 13 rules of St. Ignatius, I strongly recommend you familiarize yourself with them. And I know you write for spiritualdirection.com. Dan Burke has an incredible video series on this that's free that anyone can go find. So go look that up. It's wonderful.
Yes. I highly recommend Dan Burke's series. It's fantastic. And I'm also finishing a series of posts on spiritualdirection.com on all of the rules, breaking each one down in a way that's practically easier to understand.
So beautiful. Before we get to our final prayer tip for the episode, can you share where everyone can find you and your work, Megan?
Yes. So I am over at meganhjelmstad.com. And I am very grateful for Kylie putting that in the show notes because my last name is a doozy to spell. There's a J in there. So meganhjelmstad.com is where you can find me, and information about the book on redemptive suffering that will be coming out, and anything else that you want to connect over.
So you hinted at this earlier, but will you share what your prayer tip is on comparison?
Yes, I think it is so easy for us as women to look around, to compare, and to think we need to be doing what everyone else is doing. In fact, I wrote a chapter in the Redemptive Suffering book on comparing and despairing our suffering, because we do it with everything, whether it's appearance, prayer, suffering, parenting. And so the really beautiful truth of learning to be in relationship with the Lord is that the Lord made you through a relationship with Him and created you to have a relationship with Him that no one else can have. And no one else can fulfill that place in His heart. No one else has the same history, the same experiences, the same gifts, combination of gifts and talents, the same wounds that the Lord wants to redeem as you do. And so when you look around at others, you might see them doing something and be tempted to want to try to imitate that. But the Lord is inviting you to be in relationship with Him and to be in mission with Him in a way that no one else can be. And so remember that when you go to prayer, remember that you spend time with Him, that He has a unique language that He wants to speak to you. He has a unique call on your life that no one else can fulfill.
And that, my friends, is right where I lost Megan. We lost all internet connection, but praise God, we made it through all the tech difficulties prior to that, and we're able to record this wonderful episode for you. I pray you can take all of her wisdom on suffering to heart, and that if nothing else, you can spend a moment today pondering the beauty of God's goodness, contrary to what may be present on the surface, especially on this election day. I'm praying for all of you. Please pray for me and pray for Megan. God bless.
Beautiful souls, thank you again for journeying with me. If you have been blessed by this episode, it would mean the world to me if you would leave a review. Be sure to screenshot it, share it on your social media stories, and don't forget to tag me on Instagram or Facebook at Kylie M. Hine. Stay persistent in prayer, protect your peace, and as always, share the light of Christ with everyone around you.